In the upcoming lessons, we're going to be creating a quiz app from scratch. So this is going to be an HTML and JavaScript application that's going to make a fetch request to an endpoint that we're going to be constructing using Google Apps Script and a web app, and load a dynamic quiz game that you can play through and interact with. The content is going to be coming from the Google Spreadsheet data. So when we first come into the game, we hit the start game. It makes a connection to the endpoint. All of the sheet data is being output as a JSON object, and this is an example of the content that's sitting within the JSON object. And JavaScript constructs from that JSON object an interactive quiz game. So the number of questions that we have within the spreadsheet, this is where the content is pulled from, where we've got number of columns, one with a question, one correct answer, and then several options that we want to present to the user. So selecting, and we get a response back. This is done with JavaScript. We can move on to the next question, and it's going through all of the questions that we have within the spreadsheet. And if we're getting it correct, it's providing the feedback that it's correct. If it's incorrect, it's going to tell us wrong answer and go red. We move on to the next question until we get to the last question. And once we've gone through all of the question, it essentially gives us a report card of how we scored in the game. So we ended up getting 5 out of 6 correct questions correct. And there's also an opportunity to submit your score to the spreadsheet as well. So this is going to make a post to the spreadsheet web app and send in the data. So whatever information, whatever username I have here, I send in, and that will select that content from the name and add it into the spreadsheet as a score. So there's the score, and we've submitted the score now from the user. So this is all done with JavaScript, and as well as working with Google Apps Script in order to create the endpoint and connecting to the spreadsheet. All of the source code is included, as well as challenges and exercises in order to help you learn more about how you can create your own version of this interactive dynamic game. We're going to be preparing a spreadsheet in this lesson in order to access the data from the spreadsheet. So creating a spreadsheet, adding in some rows and columns of content. So the columns are going to represent each individual item within the arrays, and then each row will be a question with a correct answer and several options that we can use in the output of our content. And the questions can be anything, and as long as we've got the correct answer within column B, the application should be able to run, and the options are going to be optional. You can add up to 5 options for each question, and this is going to be a multiple choice question that we're going to be presenting to the user. So once we've created the spreadsheet, we're going to use Google Apps Script, logging into the Apps Script editor and selecting the sheet, getting the spreadsheet object, and then selecting the sheet from the spreadsheet object, getting the available range of data, and then lastly getting the data values, outputting it within an array, and then looping through each one of the rows of content so that we're ready to output that content within the web application, which is coming up next. You will need to have a Google account in order to access Google Sheets and access Google Apps Script and create your own spreadsheet and endpoint with Apps Script. So let's go ahead and open up a Google Sheet. You will need to have a Google Drive in order to perform this exercise, where we're going to be creating a Google Sheet and using that data within our web application. So log into your Google account, and then if you go over to Drive, this is where you can create a sheet. So selecting the New button in the top left-hand corner, that's going to open up the window where you can select Google Sheet. And this is going to serve as our data source for the content that we're going to be connecting to. Outputting the content using Google Apps Script. And Google Apps Script is just like JavaScript. It runs in the back within the Google Workspace and allows you to do more and extend what you can do within the Google Workspace services. So let's just call it data, and we'll call it data questions. Give the sheet a name, and this can be questions. So what we want to do is we want to create some data in here that we want to use, and we're going to create this as a quiz. So the first column is going to contain the question, and then the second one is going to be the correct answer, and then we'll also create some other possible answers within an array format. So this can be the different options. So call it option 1, and then we can create as many options as we want possible. So let's have a max of 5 options. And then we add in the question, what is, and then you can edit these questions as needed. So the correct answer for 5 plus 10 is going to be 15. And this is not going to be dependent on what the question is. We're just going to be looking for the correct answer. So the correct answer for this one is going to be yes. And the only other option is going to be no for this question. And you can add in your own custom questions as needed. So as long as you've got some questions to work with, the first row is going to contain the heading information. So this is what we're going to construct the object from, and we're going to use these in order to build out the quiz questions. So once you've created some data within the Google spreadsheet, I want to access this data using Google Apps script. We're going to create a standalone application, and for the standalone application, we're going to need to get the ID from the spreadsheet, and every single Google document is going to have its own ID. The easiest way to select the ID of your document, and that's going to be the unique ID, and it's going to be available within the web URL of the file. So you can select in the top where it says in the spreadsheets, it's going to say spreadsheet /d/, and this is going to be the unique ID, the identifier to select this file. And this can be done using Google Apps script. So go ahead and select the file ID, and we're going to use that as we access the data with Google Apps script. Now, in order to run Google Apps script, you can go over to google.com/script/start. There's some more information about Google Apps script, and you can select the Start Scripting button. And this is going to open up the script dashboard where you can create a new project. Under the main menu, there's going to be a button that says New Project, and this is going to create a brand new app script that you can use in order to output the content to your endpoint. We're going to be creating a web application, so a web app, deploying it within Apps script, and that's going to give us an endpoint that we can connect to and get data from. So selecting the file name, give the file a name. I'll call it data test. And then within the file, this is going to be the online editor for Google Apps script. I'll make it slightly larger so that we can easier see the content that's being written. By default, within the dashboard of the editor, you're going to see a default function called myFunction. You can rename this to a more semantic meaning name, and I'm going to call it get sheet info. And within here, create a variable, just as you would with JavaScript, and paste in the ID value of your spreadsheet. So this is going to be the spreadsheet using the ID value of the spreadsheet. Next, we want to connect to the sheet itself. So connecting to the sheet object, and I'm just going to give it a variable name of SS. And this is where we use the spreadsheet service. The spreadsheet service is within the spreadsheet app class, and this is a method that we can use in order to connect to the spreadsheet data. And there's several different options within the spreadsheet app class. When you press the dot, it's going to give you a drop-down list of the available methods that you can use. The one that we're going to be using is open by ID, because we do have the spreadsheet ID, and then add in the ID within the spreadsheet object open by ID. There's also a console log, just as you would with JavaScript, and this is going to output the content within the console. You can also use the logger log, which is the same thing, and this is the default logger application that's running within Google Apps script. And what gets returned back from the spreadsheet app open by ID is going to be the spreadsheet object, and that's going to be the actual sheet that we're trying to get the data from. So we are going to need that, and we're going to need to connect to it in order to get the contents out of it. So get the ID using the spreadsheet app class, select the method open by ID, add the ID into the argument, and then output the spreadsheet object into the console. So save it, and when you run it, you are going to have to accept permissions in order to access the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet and the account that you're using currently within the Google Apps script needs to have permissions in order to access the spreadsheet. And because I just created the sheet and I'm creating this with using the same account, my account is going to have access to the spreadsheet that I created. If you don't have access to the account that you're using to create the Google Apps script to the spreadsheet, you're going to throw an error. So let's go ahead and run the application. Within the IDE, there's options here to run to debug. Within the dropdown, if you have more than one function, you're going to see all of the functions that you have within the editor. And this is all contained within the code.js file. So all of the functions that are contained within the app script, they're going to be in the dropdown. So currently we just have the one. So we're selecting it as the default. And when we select run, we're going to get the permissions screen. There's the execution log that's opened up. And this is where our console information and logger information is going to get tracked. So the first time you run it, you will need to accept permissions, because this application is now running and it's going to be accessing the data within the spreadsheet. So select Review Permissions from the authorization screen. It's going to ask you to select an account that you want to sign in and connect to the data test application that you've just created. So select the account that you want to use. It's going to give you an error message here, a warning message that this is a Google account, and it's going to be using this account within the Google script. And again, just click the advanced and then select the go to. And in this case, my file is named data test. So it's going to provide us the file name to go to. And it's going to let us know what permissions that we're allowing for the data test application and the account that we're using for the data test application. If you do want to remove out permissions, you can go to the myaccount.google.com/permissions or click the Google account link here, and this is going to list out all of the accounts that you've provided permissions for, and this is where you can remove the permissions for the data test application. So once you've read through this, select Allow, and that's going to provide the script to run the code and be able to access the file contents. Within the console message, there's quite a bit of data that gets output, and this is going to be the information from this current console log output, and there's a lot of information that gets output there. So the easiest way to select and get the object and output the object is using the logger log. It's both outputting the same, but in this case, the console log is treating it as it would be a JavaScript object, and it's going to include all of the methods that are available within the log, within the spreadsheet object. So we want to try to avoid that and only have the logger log. The second time we run it, now we've already accepted permissions, so we can just see that we've selected the spreadsheet object and that we're ready to interact with the content from the spreadsheet. So in order to get the sheet content, we need to select a sheet that we want to work with. And within the spreadsheet object, we can have multiple sheets. So let's select a spreadsheet from the spreadsheet object. And there's a way to do that where we can select the sheet by name. And that's using the method getSheetByName. And then within here, the parameter that it's expecting is going to be the string value of the sheet name. And in this case, I've called it questions. So add in the sheet name of questions, and that will actually select the sheet object. Within the logger log, now you should be able to output the sheet as a sheet object. And there's our sheet object outputting into the log. And once we've selected the sheet object, we can then select the content of the sheet. And before we do that, we need to select the range that we want to use. And the range is going to indicate the cells of content that we want to return back from the selected spreadsheet. So using the sheet object, and then the method getDataRange, and this is going to select all of the available data that's contained within the spreadsheet that we've selected. You can log that out as well, and now we should have an available range from the spreadsheet that we can select and get the data from that range. So lastly, in order to get the data, let's select the data using the range object, and there's a method that's called getValues, which is going to return back all of the values from the spreadsheet as a nested array. So each row is going to have its own array, and each item within the column will be an item within that array. And then the main object is going to be a parent array with all of the rows as nested arrays. So let's output data into the log, run the code, and now we see that within the execution log, we've got all of the data from the spreadsheet. And once it's within this array format, we can then select the data and the data object. So looping through each item within the data, and this is going to represent a row. So just as we would with JavaScript, and then within the logger log, we can output each row of data. I'm going to comment these out so we don't have to see them anymore within the execution log. Save the file, and now let's run it again. And this is now returning back each row of data, and these are going to be arrays that we can then loop through and get the contents from those arrays. So before we move on to the next lesson, go ahead and set up your spreadsheet, open up the script editor, and connect to your spreadsheet. Select the spreadsheet, select the sheet that you want to use, select the data range, and then get the values and output them into the logger, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. You're going to be creating a web app using Google Apps Script and the doGet function. The doGet function automatically is the returned value that the Google script looks for when you deploy a web app. So it's going to return back the content that we've got within the return statement within the doGet function. And in this case, what we're doing is we're constructing a stringified version of the Google Sheet data and then outputting it into the content service. And the result is going to be that we're going to get an array with nested rows of content, and this is coming directly from the spreadsheet. So if we were to make any updates to this sheet content, so duplicating this, and this should actually be incrementing, that will give us a new set of data that we can retrieve back. So when I refresh the endpoint, that new data and that new row of content that I've just added is going to be reflected in that. So it's going to make it open for JavaScript in order to fetch the contents of this endpoint, and then we can use the contents from the spreadsheet within our web application. Go ahead and open up the editor. We're going to be creating a web app. So web apps in Google Apps Script use a default function, and the function is going to be the doGet function. And this is also returning back an parameters. So within the argument of the function, you can select the parameters and you can return that information back. So you do need to name the function doGet in order for it to run within the web app as we're going to deploying the web app. So let's select some content, and we're going to create a basic object that we can output. And this could just be a basic object that we're going to try and output the contents into the web app, and then we'll bring in the spreadsheet data and output all of that content. So we'll have a first name and a last name for the object values. And let's create this object. And we want to stringify the object as a string output. And we're going to output this object as JSON data. So creating the string output, so a string version of the output variable. And just like with JavaScript, we've got the JSON stringify method that we can make use of. So this creates a string version of the object output. We can output it into the log, and this is going to output our current string value for the object output. So let's run the doGet within the editor so we can see what within the execution log. So that's going to output the string version of the object. And there are parameters that we need to return back for doGet. So when the web app loads, it's going to look for the doGet function, and the doGet function needs to return back the content that it wants to output. And we're going to use the content service. And this is the interface that allows us to output content that gets created and output into the web page. So within the content service, there's a method called createTextOutput, and it's expecting one parameter, and that's going to be the content that we want to output. So we're going to output the content and have it return back, creating the text output. So save that. And now we're ready to deploy our web application. So in the top of the editor, you've got a button that says deploy. Select that, and then under the options of the menu, select new deployment. If you have existing deployments, you're going to have a test deployment, and you can also manage existing deployments where you can redeploy them and also update them and archive them. So select the new deployment. It's going to have the new deployment pop-up window. Under the select type cog, select web app, and this is going to provide the web app screen. Enter in a description for the web app, and I'll call it sheet data 1. You need to select an account that you want to execute the app as. Select the current account that you're using. You can also select using the user that's accessing the web app. And in that case, they're going to be asked for permissions, and we want to create this as an open web application. So we don't want to ask any permissions. We just want anyone with the URL to be able to go to it and retrieve back the data that's being output within the web app. There's also another option to who has access. So you can select here and select anyone. There's 3 options on the regular standard Google account, so it's only myself, so it has to be logged in as the current user that's running the script in order to be able to see the web app content. There's also anyone with a Google account, and that means that the user that's accessing the web URL needs to log into their Google account in order to be able to see the content. For organizational accounts, you're going to have a fourth option, and that's going to be anyone within the organization. And then lastly, there's the anyone. So this is how you can create a completely open web URL. And this is going to be accessible without any type of login or any authorization that's needed. And allowing the script to run behind the scenes using the current account with the account permissions that access the spreadsheet. And then once you've set this configuration, hit the deploy. The new deployment will output deployment ID and a web app URL. So you can copy that web app URL, or you can click it directly, and that's going to open up the web application to the endpoint. So this is actually going to be the endpoint that you can use from the URL in order to connect to it with your JavaScript code. So once you're ready and confirmed, hit done, and you can also test out the web app URL, and it's going to be returning back the content. We're going to make an update to this where we're going to actually output the content that's coming from the spreadsheet and return that back to the content output. As well, we do have an option within the create text output to set a meme type. So that's another method that's contained within here, and we can set meme type. And then within the content service, there's an option for the meme types, and we're going to set this as JSON data. So that way, when we are making our fetch request and we are returning back the content as JSON, we can directly have it as a JavaScript object because this is going to be recognized as JSON content. So for the output, we want to get the actual sheet information. So where we've got all of the data, we'll return back the data object. And this was from the previous lesson where we got all of the values from the connected spreadsheet and return them back within an array format. So running the get sheet info, let's update this. And instead of outputting the output value, we'll just get the sheet info and return that back as JSON. Now, before you try it out, if you go to the executable URL, you're still going to have the last deployed version. So that's not going to update as you update the code. But if you do want to run a test for the URL, you can go into the deploy and test deployments. This endpoint is not going to work with your JavaScript because this is only accessible to accounts that have access to the Google Apps script itself. So this is only for testing when you are creating your application where you can load the web app into the browser using the test deployment. We'd only have the one web app, so selecting that, and that's going to open up within the window, and we see that we're outputting the contents that we have within the spreadsheet. So this is all the spreadsheet content being output, and this is exactly what we wanted to select from. And we can also structure this data afterwards. So we'll make a connection to this endpoint in the upcoming lesson, and then we'll also show you how you can better structure this data within a more object format. So that's all of the data coming directly from the spreadsheet. And next, we just want to deploy it to the executable URL so that we're ready for the next lesson where we're going to be making the connection to the executable URL using JavaScript code. So back again under deploy, you can select a new deployment or you can manage existing deployments. I'm going to go ahead and do a new deployment. And this is going to be the JSON data version 2. Again, execute as the user and then anyone to have access with it, and hit the deploy when you're ready. This is going to create a new web app URL. So we can copy that, or we can just click that and open it up within the web browser. And now we should see the content coming from the spreadsheet. So if we were to update and add any content, any additional content, so let's just do another quick row of questions and make this another math question. So that answer would be 35. And then we can have some different answers here. And now when I go back out to the URL, if I refresh it, I'm going to have that new row of content within the output array of the JSON data. So that means that we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we've got the content being output within the web app URL. And this is coming from the spreadsheet, and it's an open web URL. So you can open it up within the browser and see the contents. And that's what we want because we're making a GET request to this endpoint to retrieve back the data. So this lesson, we're going to be connecting to the endpoint. So selecting the endpoint and using it within the JavaScript application to connect to the Google Spreadsheet and selecting the contents from the spreadsheet. So when we click the button, it's going to make the request to the endpoint and update the page contents with the contents of the spreadsheet data. So this data here that we have is going to be actually the exact contents that we have from the spreadsheet. So if we make any updates to the spreadsheet content, if we were to add in a couple more rows, make the request, that's going to add in those new rows of content within the spreadsheet. So whatever we have within the spreadsheet is being output right now within the web application. And this is going to be done using JavaScript, making connection to the endpoint, and then using the DOM to create elements on the fly and then populating the content from the spreadsheet content into the JavaScript page elements. Go into your Google Apps script, select under the Manage Deployments and copy the web URL because we're going to need that within our application. And then just test it to make sure that the web URL is the correct one that's returning back the sheet data. And then now let's open up our editor and update the web application. I'm going to shrink the screen down. And I've got a HTML file, so called index.html. I've got an element called output and a button with a click me. And then we've got our connection to the JS file. So within the JS file, create a variable and add in the URL under the variable URL. I'm going to update the view to word wrap so that we can see the entire statement. And now we want to make a fetch connection whenever the button is clicked and retrieve back the contents into output. And that's going to be coming from the spreadsheet data. So let's select the button element using the document, and we can use query selector in order to select the page element with the element with a class of btn. And then for the btn, let's update the text content. So it'll say get sheet data and add the event listener to the button. So when the button gets clicked, we want to run a fetch request to the URL. And then once we retrieve back the response, and the data should be coming back as JSON data. And the last promise is where we've got it as a data value, and we'll output it into the console. So this should get the live data that's coming from the spreadsheet within the array when we click the button. So there's our content, and all of the rows from the spreadsheet are going to be represented within the data value. So we can select out, and for the first row of content, this is going to be the headings for the sheet data. So we want to return back the remaining rows of data. So once we have that, we can get the rows, and using data slice, we're going to slice it at row number 1. So this is going to remove out the headers, and then the headers or the headings will be contained within data under the first item within the nested array. So that will return back that first array. Let's create a way to output the content, and we'll pass in the headings as well as the rows of data. And then we can loop through the items within these arrays. So let's create the function within JavaScript, output the data, and we can just keep it the same structure here. We've got the headings and the rows. Let's construct our table object. So the main table object, and we want to output it to the output element. So selecting the output element and using the document, and once again the query selector, select the page element from the HTML, and that one has a class of output. So we can select that page element into an object called output, and then within the tab, we're going to apply that and add that element to the page. I'll also create a function called maker, and this is going to be an easier way where we can make elements. So using the document create element, and then it'll be expecting the element type. So we can just nest that within an argument of t, and then whatever we have for the parent object. And this is just an easy way to add page elements. And we can also apply a class if we want as well. So I'll just create a variable name for C, and we'll return back the newly created element so we can make some updates to it. So the element that we want to create is going to be a table. So the tag is going to be a table. The parent is going to be the output element that we just selected from the page. And the class is going to be the table. So just create a class afterwards for a table. So let's construct the element contents, where we're using the maker and returning back that element. So the element is going to get added a class. So for the element, and then class list, add whatever we have under the C, and then return back the element object. We're going to append it to the parent. So it's coming in as the parent value. And using the append child, this is actually going to return back the element. So that way, when we click to generate the data, it's going to add the table to the page. And we go under elements, body, and within the output div, there's our table. So that way we can start creating the page elements. Next up, we want to create the table headings. So now we've got our main table parent, and we want to output the contents as a table heading. So let's next we're going to create a table row, and this is going to be where we've got the heading row. So this can give it a name of heading, and we can use maker once again. And instead of creating a table, we're going to take a tr, so table row. The parent for this is going to be the table that we just created, and I'll just call this table like that. And this can get a class of row. So that's going to add the heading cells. And for the headings themselves, I want to loop through the heading values. So using for each, and this is going to return back each one of the items. That's going to be the heading from within the headings array that we're getting from the spreadsheet. And we want to create table heading elements and apply them to the heading row. So select that heading row, and that's going to be the parent that we're applying it to. These are going to be table headings, and I'll just give it a class of th just to have some consistency. So this is going to create each one of the elements. And as we loop through the element text content, we'll set it up as the result for the element. So when we click that, that's going to generate the table, the default table with the table headings for the page. You can open up the elements inspector and just take a double look there to make sure that everything looks proper and that the structure is proper, the elements are properly nested, and we can continue to create additional content. So next, the next set is all of the rows. So we want to loop through the rows, and these are going to contain the arrays, so the nested arrays. So we'll have to loop through, and this is going to return back the row object. So for each row, we want to create a parent row. And once again, using the maker, we'll make a table row, attaching it to the main table object. And this can also have a class of row. And for each row of data, we want to loop through and get each one of the items. So this is going to be each one of the columns within the row. And this is going to return back the column data from the row. So for these, we're going to create an element and apply the column content to the element. So this one is going to be a TD cell, and it's going to be applied to the main row, which is going to be the parent of this structure. And then for each one of the elements that we created, the content that's going to be contained within there is going to be within the column. So click the get data, and that builds out basically a table that we have for the table content. And because we've applied classes to each one of these cells, we can apply some styling to those classes. So for the table and for the table headers, let's update the styling for those elements. And we can do that directly within the HTML page. So we've got a class of table header. Let's set a background color, and the background color can be black. And of course, you can update these and style these as needed. So get the sheet data. So it's going to structure it that way. We can also set for the alternating rows, for the table rows, an alternating background color. And in order to get the alternating ones, we can use the nth child and select the even rows. So select a background color for those, and let's make it slightly darker. And we can leave the text color as black. So get the data, and let's just double check just to make sure that we're selecting the page elements properly. So table rows actually have a class of row, and this time we should be able to get the output. Let's also select for the main table itself. We do have a table class for the table. So we can select the table with the table class and output for the width of it. So set the width to be 100%. And you can also do a border for it. So it's going to give us a border outline for the table. Make a connection again. So basically, if we make any updates to the sheet data and we make some requests to it, that should also update the output data. So how about we remove a couple rows and we request the sheet data again. So we're getting the live sheet data or whatever the current value of the sheet data is. If we make any updates to them, that's retrieving back the data and returning it back within our application. We can apply some more styling if needed. And of course, the styling is optional. We're just setting up a little bit more styling. So within the table cells, let's add some borders around the table cells. And the reason that we're getting the two tables is that we're not clearing out the output element. So you can solve that by, before you're appending it to output, set the inner HTML to be just blank. And that will allow us to construct a new table. And then for the table cells, let's add a slight border around the table cells. So all of the contents within the table, they're all got the class of TD. So we can select the elements with the class of TD, and we can add a border around it. And maybe we want to do just a very slight border around it and see what that looks like. And maybe make it slightly a little bit darker. And I'll also update the border class or the border style as border collapse. So set it as a collapse style. So it's going to change the border to be a very plain type border where we're not going to have the double border effect. And that will just collapse in the border items. So that's how you can select the content from your spreadsheet, bring it into your JavaScript application. Coming up next, we'll make some updates to it where we're outputting it as an object, construct the quiz in order to make an interactive quiz with the contents coming from the spreadsheet. So go ahead and try it out. Add the spreadsheet data into your web application, and you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to be updating and outputting the content in a more structured JSON structure using objects, where we've got the name for the key, and then the value for the key, and then also all of the options. So this is going to be a better way to present the data from the endpoint, and it's going to apply an easier format for us to run our application from the JavaScript code. So we're making some updates. We're also going to be chaining together some of the methods that we used in order to create it within one statement, and then looping through, getting the headings, getting the rows of content, and then structuring it as an object, and then returning that content back and outputting it within the web application endpoint. This lesson, we're going back into AppScript, and we're going to output the content from the spreadsheet as a data object. With the object structure, it's going to be a lot easier to read and understand that these are the headings, and then we can attach the values to each one of the objects. So we're going to be reconstructing and updating the way the data is being output within the JSON format, which is going to be a lot easier for us to read from our JavaScript application. So going into the AppScript editor, let's make some updates to the code that we're outputting within the do-get. I'm going to rename this original value and then create a brand new function for do-get. And this is going to output the content in a more structured format. And we'll also remove out some of the excess within the application. So we still want to output the content and get the content, outputting it as a stringified version. And I'll just call this D, and we can create a new function that will get the content that we want to output. So this result is going to be the same, and we can save it, and now it's just a shorter format. Within the object data, we want to create the output, and just as we use slice in order to select the rows, and also we got the heading information, we can do the same using the Google AppScript code. So create a function, and I'll call it data object. And what this will do is this is going to connect to the spreadsheet. We're going to need the same ID value for the spreadsheet. And then we'll simplify some of the code that we did for the spreadsheet object. So what we can do is we can actually chain together all of that spreadsheet information. So using the spreadsheet app, and we're opening it by ID. So let's open by ID. We still need to have the ID as a value. And then we're getting the sheet by name, selecting the sheet that has a name of questions. And then we need to select the data. And the same way that we did it originally, we can get all of the data values using the data range. So this is going to return back all of the available data using the get data range. And if we want to get the values, we can select the values using the get values method. So this is going to return back that entire array of data from the spreadsheet just within the one statement. And all we did is just chain together from what we did before. So let's try it out where we've got the data object, and just to make sure that we're getting the data properly. And it looks like everything is okay with the data. So what we want to do is we want to retrieve out just the rows of content and then loop through the rows. And you're going to use the map method. So this is an array method in JavaScript that allows us to reconstruct some of the content. So now we've got the data, and using slice, just as we did within our JavaScript code in previous lesson, we're going to select out all of the rows of content. So this is going to remove out the headings, because the headings are contained within that first row, and only retrieve back the contents from the rows. And now we want to get the values and the content that we want to return, and we'll build a new variable for that. And using the rows and map method, we can map out each row individually and then apply some content into it. So let's construct a temporary object, and the object is going to be using preset structure for it. And we know that the heading, the first one, is going to be the question. We can also select it dynamically using the headings. So if we want to, we could set the headings. And from the data, we retrieve back the first row of content. And then here we can use the headings and use the index value in order to retrieve back that first item in the column. And this is going to return back whatever we have, and we have it under question. So usually, because I know I want it to be sent as a question object, and just in case somebody comes in and changes the spreadsheet headings, it's going to throw the JavaScript off. So I want to have a more static way of creating the objects, and that's where we're going to be selecting the question. And the question contents, as we're looping through the rows, that's going to be returned back within the first item of the row. And that's going to represent the column content. So in order to get that value, we use the row, which is the variable for the row value, and we want to get back using the index value of 1. And then let's select and add in the answer. So the answer to the question is going to be within the row and index value of 1. So that's our basic temporary object. We also want to add in the options. So within the object, we can add in the options as an array. And this will just be a blank array right now. And we want to loop through all of the remaining columns, which we've got 5 of, using a for loop. So we know that we've got a preset number of them. And looping through while I is less than 5. And if you had more than 5, you could update that value to whatever number of columns that you want to check. And as we loop through, we want to get the value from the row with its index value. And we actually want the index value to be starting at 1 so that we're returning back including the correct answer. So we're providing all of the options, and we're going to loop through all 6 columns. So let's update this to be 6. So what this is going to do is it's going to construct, including the correct answer, an array of options that could be potentially. And we already have the correct answer here within the object, so we don't need to have it a second time. So we're checking to see if value exists, and if it does, then we're going to take the temporary object array that we just created, and using the push method, we're going to add the current value into it. So what this is going to do is it's going to construct an array within the object under options that we can loop through and provide for the user in order to make a selection of, in order to get the correct answer. And as we loop through, because we're using map, in order to add it to the new array that we're creating, which is going to be res, we return back the object that we've just created, and that's going to be under the temp value. So looping through is going to return back and construct an object. And what we want to do is we want to return back this response content once we're finished with the function, and send that information into the output that we want to see within the web application. So it looks like we're ready to deploy it. And what we're doing is we're doing a JSON stringify. So we're getting a stringified result. We can also use the logger log to test out to see what we've got for the response from the data object to make sure everything is working. Let's run the doGet. And it looks like there is an error that's not able to push into undefined. So let's take a closer look and see what we've got. So I had missed the name for the array, which is ops. So again, we'll run it. And now it looks like it's constructing the proper object array of items, and they are comma separated. So each one has a question, each one has the correct answer, and then the options that we want to display to the user in order to make a selection from for the quiz. So it looks like everything is working properly, and we're ready to deploy it as a web application. So go under deploy, new deployment. I'm going to enter a description, object, JSON, execute the app as me, who has access, so anyone, and we'll click the deploy button, and that's going to create the endpoint. So let's copy that, and we're going to need that within the JavaScript code in the next lesson. and try it out and see what we've got as a result. So this is our new endpoint that we're going to connect to using JavaScript. And this is a more structured JSON object where we've got object format that's going to give us the name pair values. So we've got the name of the value and then the value that's being associated with that key value. And we can use that more effectively as we're building out our front-end application within our web application. Within this lesson, we're going to be creating a quiz game, and the data is going to be coming from the spreadsheet data. So that's the spreadsheet that we have on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the JavaScript application. So we kick that off by pressing the Start Game. So there's our AJAX interaction with the endpoint that's being put out for the data from the web application. So this is fully interactive, and it's going to load all of the answers and questions. So first question, what is 5 plus 10? We've got all of the options here, as well as the correct answer. So we select it. If we got it correct, we get a feedback that it's correct answer. It goes green, and we get an option to move to the next question. We also have, do you like JavaScript? So no or yes. So those are the two options. And let's select yes, so that was correct. How many wheels on a car? Just clicking through them in order to demonstrate what we're going to get as an end result. So once we've completed the quiz, we get essentially a report card on how we scored. So we ended up getting 4 out of 6. And we get the green, the results in green for what we got correct, and the results in red for what we got incorrect. We're going to be connecting to the endpoint where we've got the new structured data that's coming from the Google Spreadsheet. So I've created an HTML file linked to a JS file called app1. And the first thing that we're going to add in is going to be the URL. So this is going to be the URL to the endpoint. And this is coming from the web app of Google Apps script. And then next we want to select the page elements. So select the element, the button element. And that we can do using the document and then query selector in order to make a selection of the element. And I'm selecting the element with a class of btn, so the button element. Make this slightly smaller and to give us a little bit more space with the code editor. And next up, I want to select the element where we're going to output the content, the quiz content in. So this is where all the game content is going to go, and using the document query selector, selecting the element with a class of output. So that selects our 2 page elements from the HTML, and that prepares us in order to start getting the content from the web page. So that first thing we want to do is add an on click to the button. And whenever the button gets clicked, then we want to start the game. So we'll create actually a function that will start game, and we'll invoke that function. So create the function start game. And this is where we're going to make our connection to get the data. And also for the button, I'll add text content to the button start game. So when the button gets clicked, apply the styling of display none, so that will hide the button from the page after it gets clicked. So the user actually isn't going to be able to click it again. So that just hides the button from the page, and we're ready to output our game and our interactive game object. So let's use fetch in order to connect to the URL. And using then, we will select all of the data. We'll make a request to the endpoint, and we'll pull all of the data in within a global object. So create an object called game, and then within there you can add in the data, and this can just right now just can be an empty object, and then we'll populate some content into the game data object once we retrieve it back after we've done the fetch request. So this is the initiation and the starting of the game. We're going to get a response object back, and then that response object we want to return back to the next stage of the promise using, and that's going to be returned back as data, as JSON data. So what this is going to do is this is going to load all of the data, and right now we'll just output into the console and make sure that we do have the right connection. So there's our rows of questions, and it's structured within an object format. So we have a question, we have an answer, and then the options that we want to display to the user for the page. So now that we've got the data array, we can output the content to the page. So build game, And this is where we're going to build the game once we have the content ready and loaded. And we can also add this as game data as well, if we do need to reference it and access it. So using the game data object, we'll set the data for the game there. And because the build game is going to be invoked after we assign the game data, the value of data, and this is after we've retrieved back the data within the fetch request, that means that that data object is going to be there. So we don't actually have to pass through data, and we can create the function because this is going to be working off of the global value. So get the game data, and for now we'll output into the console the global game data value, just to make sure that we do have it at that point before we try to use it. So that will load and load the content into the console once the game is ready. You can also output to the output text content and just a message to the user, starting game, loading data. And so this will provide the user some information about what's actually happening behind the scenes. And then once the game data is loaded, then we're going to clear out the output area. So we've got all of the game data loaded within an array. So let's loop through the game data and we'll output the content onto the page. And so because we want to be able to load the questions, we want to start with loading the first question. So this is going to be another object within the game object, and we'll set that to 0, and that's going to be loading the first question into the game. So for the build game, we'll load the question, and the question, because we're housing it once again within the global game object, we don't actually have to send a value into there, and we just load the question. So we want to increment the game question. And in this case, because we're building the game, we don't need to increment it. It's just going to load as a value of 0. So when we do the load question from the game data, we're going to create the question object from the game data using the index value of game. And this is going to be the index value which we can get from the question value. So let's console log out what we've got so far for the value of question. And this is going to be what we're going to be loading from the sheet data. And when we click the build game, so if there's anything else that we need to do within the game before we load the question, we can take care of that within this function. So once we have the question, we're loading the question within the console. So that means that the question is ready, and we're ready to output the question content. So let's take output and update the inner HTML. And we can just clear whatever we've got the contents for the inner HTML. And then we'll update the content from the question object. So once again, load the question object so that we can open it up within the console. And first up, we want to have a main container for the question. So once again, just like the last lesson, we'll create a function that will allow us to create the element. So getting the tag, getting the parent, getting the class, and we can also get the HTML contents that we want to add into the element. So this will create a function that will make an element, and let's make the main parent. The tag that we're going to use is going to be a div. The parent that we're outputting it to is going to be the output element. The class that we can set can be main, and then the inner HTML will just be blank. So let's create the element using the document create elements, and the element is going to be whatever we've got for the tag name, and then return it back, appending the child, which is going to be the newly created element, to the parent. And let's go ahead and we're going to add a class using class list and add. So the class that we're adding is coming from the parameters in the maker function. And for the element, we're going to set the inner HTML to whatever we've got the result for the variable value of h. So that creates the page element with a class of main. So we're ready to load the question content into that element. So let's create the question. And once again, we can use the maker and output the content. So we'll create it as a div. This is going to be appended to the main. This can have a class of question. And the contents that we have here, so this is coming from the question data, and it's going to have an object key name value of question. So let's see what happens when we click the output. And now we get the question being output on the page. So we want to provide options for the answers, and we will make these elements clickable so that the user can select and click one of the options. So the options is going to be in an array, and that's contained within the question object. So just as we've constructed it within the app script, this is where we can loop through the question options and loop through each one of them that's available there. Now, one of them is going to be the correct answer. We also want to sort them randomly. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to actually sort them randomly. And we can do this with randomizing the array content. And in order to randomize an array, this is using the sort will actually sort it in place. And then the sort can actually have some parameters within the arguments where we can set the value. So if it's positive, it will go incrementing, and if it's negative, it will go descending. So within this, if we have a function where we're returning back a random value that could either be positive or negative, this is going to randomize the sort order. So we're doing math random, and math random will return back a value from 0 to just before 1. And if we subtract to 0.5, that will give us a roughly 50-50 chance of returning back either a positive or negative value. So randomly sort the items of the array. So let's loop through each one of the elements or the items within the questions array, and this is within the options. And we want to add these to the page as an option. So we can create them as a span. So using the maker and span, I want to add them to the main object. So set the main object, and the contents of this is going to be whatever we have for the element. And then adding in, actually this should be the class. So this is going to be the option selection. I'll give it a class of box. And we can apply the styling afterwards in order to be able to see the contents. So as we create these, we also want to make them clickable. So that outputs them all of the possible answers on the page. And I know it's not easy to read, but if you go into the element inspector within the HTML and we open the question up, we have a different span for each one of these. So let's apply some styling to the elements before we continue. And this is going to make it so that this is a lot more readable and a lot more user friendly. So we do have a class of question. So this is going to be where we've got the main question content. So adding in a padding around that, we can also apply some styling. So maybe we want to have a larger font size. Also to the main element. So that's going to be the main container for the question. Let's add in a border and do a light border. I can also do some padding around that. Let's set a width, so 90%. And let's center it, so margin of auto. So I didn't actually get to the spans, but that gives us a better idea for the question. And we should also, for the question that we're asking, so once we're delivering and creating the question content, let's create a string value, and then we'll wrap this within the template literal, and that way we can add in the question mark into the code. So also for the spans, they're going to be contained within an element that's got a class of box. So this can provide us some padding between the elements. Also, let's add in, and for the box on hover, I'm going to update the background color so that they look like they're more clickable or more selectable. We'll flip the colors So whenever it's hovered over. Also for them, let's update the pointer. So whenever we're hovering over the cursor pointer, to set it to pointer, and maybe even add a border so that we can distinguish them. And actually, let's do the border bottom. And we'll do a border of it. And let's see what that looks like. So that should give us all of the options. Let's add in some margin between them as well. So that will separate them all out. And now whenever we hover over them, they're going to get that hovering effect. So that's with the styling. So we need to make a selection of one of these as the answer. So adding an event listener to that span element will allow us to make the selection and even check to see if we've got the correct answer. So the span on click. And we're actually going to add it as an event listener. So this way, when we're using the event listener, then we can also remove out the event listener. So we're adding it as a click. And the event that we're going to be listening for is going to be the function of checker. Also within the span, I'm going to add in a value within the span element object, and this is going to be whatever the correct answer is. So for the object within JavaScript, we sent out and we've got the answer within the object, and that's going to be under the Q answer value. So that way, when we launch the checker function, let's invoke checker, and we can also select the elements. And for the span, for the selection option, we can also add in the element value in case we need it. So that way we don't have to pass it within the element object, and we can always pick up the element object that triggered the event. So the element is going to be within the E target. And for now, let's just console log out the E target value for the correct, and also the element that we had for the selected option. So let's see what happens here where we're loading the content. It'll clear the console, and now when we click it, we get the correct answer, which was 15, as well as we get the answer that was selected, which is 25. So in this case, we know that that one's the correct one. So for the element, we don't want them to be clickable anymore. We want to select all of the elements with a class of box and apply some styling to that so that we can gray them out. So once the selection is made, we want to update the target to be either red or green, depending on if they got it correct. And then we want to remove out the event listeners from all of the elements. So let's select the elements with a class of box, and using the query selector all, select all the elements with a class of box. So that will pick up all of the elements, and we need to select it from the document object. And that will give us a list of elements. And we can loop through the boxes, so using for each. That's going to give us the element. And as we loop through, we want to remove event listener. And the event that we're removing is going to be the click. And the function that we're removing is going to be the checker. So once it's clicked once, it's going to remove the option from all of them. So none of them are going to be clickable after we've made that selection. We also want to loop through the elements and apply the style. And let's update the color of the elements so that it looks more like it's grayed out. So that's a lighter color. And the element disabled, and set that to true. And before we try that, we need to update this to select the element with a class of box. So let's go ahead and we'll try it out. And now when we click it, that should gray out all of the elements, so they're not clickable anymore. And we also want to remove out the hover option, so we can remove from the element using class list and remove the class of box from it. That's going to remove all of the styling from those elements. And what happened is we weren't able to specifically select the hover. So let's add in a separate class that's going to be just for the hover. And we'll remove out the elements with a class of box. And then within the span, using class list add in the element class of box1. So the box1 will be doing the hover, and that's going to prevent us from removing the styling. So that way they're not going to be hovering anymore. So we also have the correct values that we can make use of. So whenever the correct answer, we need to make a check to see if these values are going to be equal. And if they are, that means that the player actually scored them properly. And that means that they should get a point. So let's create a score here as well and start that out at a score of 0. And then as we're looping through, so that would mean that the game score is going to increment by 1. Let's provide some feedback to the user. So selecting from the main game object will apply to the output. So we'll create another element, and this will just provide a message to the user, and we can apply to the output correct answer. Also for the element, since we've got the element selected, we can apply some styling to it. Let's do a color for it and set the color for it to be green. And actually we'll set it white and we'll do the background color. So this will indicate to the player whether they got it correct or not. So set the background color, and then this can be setting it to green. And if they didn't get it correct, so create an else statement, and this will just say that wrong answer. And we can also output what the correct one is if we want for the player. So this is optional, so we can output what the correct value is. Was this value, and set this up and set it to be red. And then we want to move to the next question. So regardless of whether they've got it right or wrong, let's make a selection, and wrong answer was 15. So we should also create a button, and when the button is clicked, it'll move to the next question. So create another element, and this is just another dynamically generated element for the page. So call it button1, and this can be a button element applied to the output. So that's the main element. We can give it a class of main, or we can give it a class of button, or button1, so we can make it distinct. The content for it, next question. And we can also here, we can control to see how many questions are left as well. So we can output the question and show you how many questions are left. So we can add that in to the game. So when this button is clicked, so on click for this button, let's run an anonymous function. And the function that we're running, so this is just going to move it to the next question. So what we want to do is we want to load the question again. And that's going to clear out all of the output HTML. So load question, and we want to increment the question to the next question. So let's do that here where we've got the game and the question. We're tracking the question value within the QUE and add 1 to it. Within the console, we'll output how many questions are remaining. So we can do that within the string value. So the remaining questions are going to be a value of what we have for the total questions within the main game data object length, because that's going to be an array. So the game data length value and subtracting the game question value. So it's going to tell us how many are remaining, and then we can apply a condition on the amount that's remaining in order to apply some logic into the game. So this should load us to the next question whenever the button is clicked. And because we're not doing any additional options here, we can just have this as loading the next question to simplify the statement. And now let's try it and we'll see if it works. So what is 5 plus 10? 4, wrong. We get an option to the next question, correct, next question. And eventually we're going to throw an error because we're going to run out of questions. So this is where we need to actually end the game and provide the user the score. So this is over here where we're got remaining, and if the value of remaining is 0, then we want to end the game. So we don't want to create a button that has the on click where we're ending the thing. We want to create the button that's going to end the game, so that when we don't have any remaining. So we'll create a value called total, and this will just take whatever value we had here for remaining. And we can just output the total value here. And before we add the button click, we'll check to see if total is equal to 0. And if total is equal to 0, then we want to end the game and output the score. Otherwise, we'll add the on-click button to the page. And it's going to load the question. And if the game is over, then we can make a function to output the results. So end game function when the button is clicked, and we'll update the text content of the button to say game over, see score. So they click the end game function, and that's going to output the score results within the output element. So let's loop through and update the score that we have. And we can also track within the questions what the response was. So let's do that so that way we can more accurately output a score to the user. So right now for the game over, we'll output within the text content, and we'll say game over. And then we'll update this to add in the score contents. So for the answers array, I want to track the answer that the user provided, and we can generate that within the checker whenever we're selecting the answer. So that's going to be within the game answers. We're just going to push in the result that we had. And this is whatever we've got for the selection. And we can always get the question and the correct answer from that original question array. And maybe here when we do the game over, we'll console log the results of game. And this can actually be the stringified version of the game object, so that we can see the results there when we end the game, and then we'll construct it better for the user to be able to make it more readable. So let's play through the game. And this is data, once again, coming from the spreadsheet. And we have to probably style the next question button. And when we end the game, so we get the game over, and we're outputting all of the results. So now that we've been tracking the answers that the user has provided, let's loop through the game answers, and we'll construct the content for the user. So the game answers, and using for each, we'll get the elements and then the index value. And you can use the index value to retrieve back the original data question from the question object. So let's create an element. So this is going to be a div using the same maker function that we were using before. So I can just copy that and make an update to it. So that's going to be a div. It's going to output and applying a class of main, and then the content for it. So within the main container, we're not going to add anything. And then we'll create the content of it. So looping through, and actually we'll create an element for the HTML and using let. And then we'll pass in this value into the div as we construct the page element and add it to output. So within the HTML, we can select the content. So the question value is coming from the game data, and we can use the index value of IND. The correct answer is going to be within the game data with the index value, and that one actually should be question, as we're selecting the question object. And then within here is we're selecting the correct answer, your response. And then this is where we can just output whatever the response was. So that will add all of those values. And then as we loop through, then we can, the last line, we can create another element, and this can output the score. So HTML score. And then we'll add that into the div. So creating a total for this. So we got that the player has a game score out, and then this is going to be whatever we've got for the game data length. So I think we're ready to try it out, and let's play through the game and see what we end up scoring. So that gave us a result. That correct was 15, we said 25. Correct was yes. Your response was yes, so that's the one that I got correct. And then we can go through here and list those out. So also for the element, if we got it correct, so let's set a background color. And here we've got enough data to check to see if the answer was correct. So if it's equal to the element, then the value is going to be green. Otherwise, the value will be red. And then take the div style and set the color to be whatever we want for the background. It's not really the background, but it's just going to be representing the text color. So that's going to make it a little bit easier to read what we've got for the output. And then this line, we don't need to output all of that stringified content. I'm going to clear out the current contents of the inner HTML. And now we should be able to generate a score for the game. So as we play through, and we got to apply some styling still to the next question button. And this is going to give us our total score. So 2 out of 6. And then we've got the response. So I think this is actually kind of long. So we can just shorten it with an R for the response. So that will make it a little bit more readable. And of course, you can apply the styling as needed. So go ahead and try it out and build your own version of the game, apply some styling, get some data from the spreadsheets in order to learn more about what you can do with JavaScript and Google Apps Script. So let's apply some styling to the next button. So moving that over, so selecting it, and we did give it a class of btn1. So let's do a display and set it up as a display block. And then set the margin to be auto, so that will center the content. And then we can set the width of it to a default width. And add some margins around it, padding around it as well. And of course you can style the button as needed. I'll update the color of the button. And then of course the background color as well, so let's set that. And also we can do a font size. And set the font size to be slightly larger, because I want this button to really stand out. So we've got the next question. So that way it stands out a little bit more. We can also apply the same styling to the button, the element with the class of button. So that's that start button that we have. So for the start game, makes the button bigger and stand out a little bit better. And of course you can apply whatever styling makes sense within the application. We're going to be creating a JavaScript application that we can have 2 input fields. Input field values, when we click the button, the action is it's going to submit contents using fetch, and using the post method, submit the form data as a body object into the Google Apps script. And the Google Apps script is going to pick up the post request within the JavaScript code, select out from the parameters that are sent in, and if there is a value for score and name, it's going to update the spreadsheet values with those values and then return back to the client side the row ID that we've inserted the data into. So let's go ahead and we'll try it out. So we press the click me button, and that's going to add the name and whatever value we had here for the score, sending it over the Google spreadsheet. And this is coming from the HTML file with the JavaScript code using fetch and the post method in order to submit the data to the AppScript web app endpoint that picks up the post, uses that in order to populate content within the sheet. Google AppScript has a doGet method, which we've just been using for the web app, and there's also a doPost method. The doPost allows us to post content to the endpoint, and we can use the same endpoint as we're using the doGet. So for the post, we're going to first capture the post content, and then we'll make use of it within our Google AppScript code and update the scores from the quiz into the spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and we're going to add another sheet, and this can just say score, and we want to send over to the endpoint that using a score value, and we also want to get the user's name. So there's going to be two parameters that are going to be entered in, and we're going to pick up that information and make use of it. So let's select the data that's coming from the E parameters, and we'll output that. So just create a simple variable, and then using the JSON stringify, we'll stringify the event object that's being passed into the doPost and return back. So within the content, using the same content service as we did for the output, we can create the text output from the output variable and also set the meme type. And the same way that we just did before, we set the meme type using the content service, and meme type, set it to JSON. So the big downside about using the post, it's a little bit harder to troubleshoot. So we'll need to send some data over to the post, and we need to make sure that we're able to get a response back from it. So enter in and get the event, the E parameters, and that's coming from the post parameters. And this is where we're going to contain the body contents that is being added into the post. And then once we can deconstruct it, then we can simply select it and add it into the spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and we're going to select the spreadsheet as well. In adding it to the spreadsheet, we just need to append a row of the content. So we've got the ID for the spreadsheet. And then let's select the spreadsheet object. So using the spreadsheet app, and then open by ID. So select the spreadsheet by its ID, and then the sheet that we want to use is contained within the spreadsheet object, and we just use the get sheet by name, the same one that we used before, and then this is going to be selecting this spreadsheet, which has the name of score. So add that in, and then within the sheet we can append a row, and this is going to be expecting an array of content. And this is also where we can just add the output content into it. So what's going to happen whenever time we post, we're going to be capturing that data and appending it to the score, and then we can break it apart and update those values within the score. So let's deploy this as a brand new web app. You can call it post endpoint. Select that anyone has access to it. So again, this is going to be an open endpoint with no authentication. So anyone sending a post request is going to be able to add data into the spreadsheet. Copy the deployment URL, go back into your code editor. I've got a HTML file with the output and the button within the JavaScript, so link to a new JavaScript file. I've just called it app2.js. So that's going to be the endpoint that we're submitting to. So whenever the button is clicked, we want to submit to this endpoint. I'm going to get rid of the styling that we had from the previous lesson and just save that. So we just have our plain HTML elements. We want to select the button to make a clickable element object. So selecting the button, and again using the same query selector, select the element with a class of button. And then we'll also select the output area as well, so that we both have both page elements ready to go and ready to be interacted with using our JavaScript code. So for the button, and also going to create a page element, and we'll add this one as an input to the output element. So this will be an input field, which we can trigger and submit using the button. And we're going to actually have two inputs, so input 1 and input 2. So using document and create element, the element that we're creating is going to be an input. And do a second one as well. I'm just going to copy the line of code, create the second input element. And then I want to update and set some properties to those. So for the elements, and before we add the event listener to the button, we can add the event listener to the button. So that's our event listener for the button. So for the my input 1, let's set an attribute and set it up as type text. And the other one is going to be a number. So my input 2 is going to have a value of type number. And then we'll set some default values for these. So the text will have a default value, so we don't always have to fill them in. So that will be a value for the name. And then we also want to have a value for the score. And let's set the score at 1,000. And then we need to append those to the page as well. So within the output, let's append the my input 1. And then we'll also append the my input 2. We can add a text node to output. So this can be used as a label. So label 1, using the document create text node. And it will just be the name. And with the text nodes, they're not elements, they're just going to be text content. So if we append it before the input, that should show that value as a label. And then this is going to be the score. So we append to the first one, label 1, and then before the second one, label 2. So let's see what we got there. And that gives us the two names there that we can use. We might also want to set these up as separate lines. So within the styling, we can do this with styling and selecting the input. And for the input, we can display it as block, and that will create separate lines for each one of those. So that's a little bit easier to read on the page. So we want to be able to click the button and post the data from the elements into the form. So let's set this, and we're going to actually create a function that will send the data. So it's going to be a little bit cleaner in the code. So send data, and this is where we're going to be making a fetch request using post to the endpoint URL. So first off, let's create the form data object. And this is done with JavaScript using the form data object. So it's going to create a new form data object. And so for the form data, we can append items to it. And we want to append the name value. And the value for the name is going to be whatever we have for the contents of the my input 1. So it's going to be whatever the current value is for that. And let's append the score, which is going to be coming from the my input 2 value. So it's going to be the score. And this is going to be the name that's going to be used whenever we're retrieving it back on the server side within the Google Apps script. So we've got the form data, and let's using the fetch to the URL. And the URL, because we're using post, we need to set the properties for it. So we can set the method, and by default, if we don't set a method, it's just going to use the get. But if we want to use post, then we can set it as post. And for a form, you do want to use post, and with post, you are able to send a body object. So we can send the form data body object. And then once we get the connection, we want to retrieve back the response. So this is going to be the returned value and coming back as JSON data. And then whatever we want to do with the response data, so this is now just going to be as a data object. And then we can do something with that once the submission has been made. So this is just going to be outputting whatever we get back whenever we hit the response. So this is going to be coming from the response from the server. So let's try it out and see what happens. So we ended up submitting the content. Let's go over to the spreadsheet. So there's our eParameter object that we submitted. And within the parameter, we have a score and we have a name. So those are the two values that we want to get out of the object. And then we want to submit those into the spreadsheet properly. So we just want the score and the name. We don't need the rest of this information. This is just an example of what is potentially available within the eParameters. And there's quite a lot of information that's contained there. So you can select it either from the parameter or the parameters. So these are going to be returning them back as arrays. So let's select that and we can remove that value. And here I'm going to set a name and a score. So that way when we do send the data over to the spreadsheet, we're going to be picking it up using the headers there within the form fields, and then we can deposit the information in the appropriate column. So let's go back over to the Google Apps script. And now we're going to update the code within the editor in order to retrieve back data. And using the do post, it's a little bit tricky. So I'm going to create a testing function that's going to do the same thing, where instead of doing the post, we'll set up an object. And that object is going to be the data that's coming from what we had within the parameters. And I want to set this up as a usable object. And this is the same thing that's being submitted into the do post, and with the same values within the parameters. So this way we can check to see within the parameters object what we've got contained in there. So this can be also just representing E. So that way it's the same value that we've got here within the do post. And these are the same values that we're getting sent in. So we want to be able to select from the parameter and check to see if it's got a name value. And if it does have a name value, then we're going to be associating it to that correct column. And we want to get all of the spreadsheet content. So getting it by ID. And let's get the spreadsheet object first. So we've got the ID that we're just going to copy from the previous. And we want to select the sheet object. And this is where we can use the get sheet by name method and select the same sheet name that we have here for score. And we want to get the headings that are contained within the sheet, and then apply to the correct index value the content that we're submitting into the spreadsheet. So we want to check to see if the headings are going to have the same values as the parameters, and then check within the parameters object for the various heading values. So we want to select the sheet data and get the first row of headings. And we can do that by using the sheet get data range. So that's going to select all of the content and then get the values. So using the get values method and returning back all of the values, but we only want to get the first row of contents. So let's use the logger log, and we'll output the headings into the log. So let's run the tester function. And now we get the name and the score being output into the log. And this is going to be as an array. So loop through the headings and use for each. So this is going to be whatever the heading value is. And we're going to be using the array method. So we want to check to see within the E parameter object if we have a value of either the score or the name. So we're going to change the heading to be lowercase. So let's just create a separate value for that and use heading to lowercase. And then we can use the logger log and output the value. And then also let's select from the object where we're going to check for the value to be in the E parameter of the object. And if it is, then we can output into the log the E parameter. Else, let's output into the log not found. So we can just use the template literal format and then do the $ in order to select the value and then not found. So now let's see what happens as we run through it and run through tester. So let's see what we got the response for. So for the name, that was found, and there was a value that was associated for it. So let's select that, and using the bracket notation in order to retrieve back the value from the eParameter object. So now we should be able to see the values that are being associated with those parameters. And then as we're looping through, we can also get the index value, and this will indicate what part of the array that we're going to be inserting these items into. So let's create an array, and this will just be a blank array, and we can use this to append it to the row, and we're going to get the index value as we're iterating through. So this is going to return back the index value, and here we can set the value within the array using the index value to what we have for the parameter, and save that. And then lastly, let's take the sheet object, and using the append row method, we're going to add the row of contents to it, and that's going to be coming from the array that we've created. So let's go ahead and create and add the array that we've just constructed and append it to the sheet and run the tester application, and then go into the spreadsheets, and we should have the name and the score inserted into the next row of the spreadsheet. Run it again to test to make sure we're okay. You can also update some of the values so it's not exactly the same, and run it another time just to make sure that everything is working properly. If, for instance, we don't have a value for the name, but we have value for the score, so that will just deposit it within the score and leave the name blank. So if it doesn't find the parameter value within the submitted data, it's just going to leave it as blank. So now we're ready to move this code into our do post. And we can also set this up and set it as an object. So passing it into the tester, and update this to updater, and comment out the testing string that we had. And then we can return back the sheet, get the last row is going to return back a value of the last row. So that will tell us which row that we've inserted that record into. So we can return that back to the user. So once we've got the output, let's send that into updater. And then we don't need to append the sheet. So we can remove that statement out. And the output, you can do a JSON stringify of the output object. And let's construct the object within the object format. We're going to get the row ID returned back. And then we can also output the JSON data and use the JSON stringify to stringify the event object. And then output that as the returned response to the do post. Let's update the deployment web URL. We're going to the manage deployments, and we'll just update this current one. Select the post endpoint, the one that we were just using. You can set a new version to it. Add a description, so call it post endpoint version 2. And it's going to be using the same web app URL. And that should update the script. So now when we run the web application, we should be able to submit content into the spreadsheet. So let's bring the spreadsheet over on the left-hand side, the web application on the right-hand side, and we'll clear the console and make a submission. So now, whatever content we have here, if we're to update that, that's going to now be submitting the content that we have from the score and from the name and adding it into the spreadsheet data. And it's returning back the ID, which is actually going to correspond to the row value that we've submitted the item into. So let's continue to update the web application. I'm going to bring the sheet object and the script object back over to the right-hand side. And now when we play through the game, we want to be able to submit the score information of the user and add it into the spreadsheet. So that's coming up next. We're going to finalize this application. So for now, try out and make sure that you can send from your client-side code, from your JavaScript code, to your spreadsheet, updating the content within the spreadsheet coming from the input fields. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson, where we're going to be able to get questions from the spreadsheet and have the player play through the questions on the spreadsheet. And also on the same spreadsheet, we're going to have a scoring sheet that's going to track the score of the number of questions the player got correct, as well as the value of the total of questions that were presented to the player. So let's go ahead and we'll try it out and we'll play through the game. So the questions are coming from the questions sheet, and whatever number of questions we have as the game loads, when we click the start game, that's the number of questions that are going to be loaded. So starting out with the first question, and then it provides us feedback if we got it correct or incorrect. And then going through, depending on how we're scoring, it's going to provide us an end score sheet. So once we reach the end of the questions, then it totals the score, tells us how many we got correct out of 6 questions, and then also provides us an area where we can send the score to the sheet. So only parameter it requires is the name. So let's add in the name and send the score over to the sheet. So that tracks it within the scoring spreadsheet and commits the score at that time with the user's name, the score that the user had done, and the number of questions that were presented to the user. And this is all going to be done with the Google Apps script using the do-get and do-post endpoints, as well as JavaScript, where we're going to be dynamically creating the page elements depending on the JSON data that we're retrieving back from the web app endpoint. So this lesson, we're going to be pulling together what we've done in the previous lessons, where we've got the quiz. We're going to load data from the quiz into the application, make it interactive, and then lastly, once the user finishes playing, they're going to have an opportunity to submit their score into the spreadsheet. So we've got all of the styling from the original HTML, and we're linking to a brand new file called app.js. So let's go ahead and we're going to create that file. I've got the other 2 files open as well. So this is the one that we're sending the score information, and then this is the entire quiz. So we're going to do a combination of both of those in order to make this happen. So create the brand new, and we'll call it quiz.js. This is going to be our finalized quiz. So link to that. And I'm going to first copy the quiz content, and then we'll make sure that the quiz is running, and then afterwards we can load all of the rest of the interaction to the endpoint. So let's try that out, and we've got the load the game. So what is the result here? So next question. So everything looks like it's working. So when we get to the final part of the game, this is where we want to make use of what we've got in the previous lesson, where we can submit the score. So we want to generate the 2 input fields and send the form data over. We're going to be using the same URL as the endpoint. We've selected the elements for output. So let's copy over this remaining content, and we already have that maker function in here, so we can make use of that as well. So within the end game function, this is where we're going to provide the opportunity to submit the score. Within the send data, this is where we can send the data content over. We can keep this function intact, and we need to make some updates to where we're ending the game, because we don't have the inputs that we are creating within the end game. So we want to add those input fields where we've got the final score, and then just below here, this is where we want to create the submit the score content and add that into the output area. So we can create the 2 elements, the input elements, and then set the value of the input elements, where we can set the value for the score within the input 2. And we're only probably going to need just the 1 input, so that we've already got the values for the score and number of questions. And we'll do a quick update to the sheet where we've got the score and the questions, and this is going to be just a value of total. So we'll log the total number of questions, and then we've got the score out of the total that we're going to be adding into the spreadsheet. So we've got the input, and the only input value that we need is going to be the user's name. So let's set a default value there. So, and of course, once you go live, you can remove out the default value for it. We don't need to set a label for score. So we'll just create a label for the input. And then we're going to apply these, appending them to the output area. So the first one is going to be the label. And then the second one is where we're going to apply the input field. And then we also need to create a button. And then this button, whenever it gets clicked, this is the one that can send the content over to send the data. So let's create that button. And I can use the maker function that we have already created. And this requires some parameters. Set up a button. The parent is going to be output, and the class can be button1. And then the contents of the button can just be send score, or whatever you want it as the customized value. So whenever the button gets clicked, then we're going to invoke the sending of the score data. So let's reconstruct this, and also we need to add in the third field that we want it to, which is going to be the total. So the total and the score, the only ones that are going to be coming from the input field value are going to be the ones that we're using. And here, we're not going to be able to pass the input field value when we're sending the button. So we need to have an anonymous function, and within the send data, this is where we can add in the input field value. So we want this to happen whenever the value is clicked, and then that's going to send over the value to send data. And the rest of the score and the total we can pick up from the global object. So this is going to be the name value, and we'll use that instead of the input field value. And where we're appending the score, so this is going to be the total score that the player scored, and we have that within the game score object. And then the game data length is going to tell us how many questions the player played. So there's the game data length is going to update the total value. And then we get a response back from the console. So let's update, and we're going to remove out the output content, and we can just say the score is submitted. Or we can send over the element where we've added in to the input area. So let's actually create a parent for the input area, and then we'll add the input area and append it to this element. So we only allow them to have the one input. So I'll just call it user in, and then using the maker function, we're going to create a div, and this is going to be just serving as a parent. And then we'll pass that object over into the send data, and then this is also the element that we can update. So if we add in the buttons and the input into this, then we can select those and remove out those elements. So this one, the parent is going to be the output element. The class for it, so we can just give it a class of main, and there's no content that's going to be added into it. So this is just going to be a main container that we're going to append the label, we'll append the input, and then also append the button into. And sending that over as our main container. So this is going to be the main container element. And then once we get response back from the data, we can take the element and update the inner HTML with the result that we got back from the data, where we're returning back the row value. So for now, we'll console log the data, and we're just going to put for the user score submitted. Thank you. I think we're ready to try this out. So let's go through the gameplay, and we'll check to see if the updates are working properly, and we'll have the console open in case we throw any errors. So first it loads the game data from the spreadsheet, and the endpoint for the post and the get is going to be the same. So let's go through this. And now we should see that our final score 3 correct out of 6. So we can have our name there. So this is going to be empty when we go live, and it's got an option to send score to sheet. So let's click that and see what happens. So it looks like we ended up having an error there and failed to fetch send data. So let's take a look and see what happened. And in order to do an exercise in debugging, So we're going to have to play through the application several times. So I want to make sure that we're sending through within the console log. You can use this to do your debugging. So I'll make sure that I've got the elements that I'm sending through within the send data, and that also that I'm retrieving back the values properly. So within the console log, let's make sure that we've got a value for val name, and then also we're going to output within the console log the form data object to make sure that that is working properly. And maybe we can just remove out the total for now. And let's make an update to the spreadsheet. So where we've got the questions, so we'll remove out all of the extra questions. Go over to the score, so nothing actually got submitted. Let's rename the function to send e-data, so in case that's a reserved word, and we'll also update the URL to the new executable URL where we do have the updated post value. So that could have been a reason for the error, and I think we could try that again now that we've got less data, and we could also try to send the form data and the score data, so sending through the name of the person, and then also the game score. So let's update those and try it again. So now we got the answer correct, and let's see what happens when we submit the score. So this time it seems to go well. We were able to update the element, and we'll see if we were able to submit the score, which we were. So let's open up the spreadsheet, and we see we got the number for total, and that's going to be correct as well. So let's go back to the questions, and we'll update and add in the questions that we just removed, and also go over to the score and clear out the existing scores that we have within the spreadsheet, and try that one more time. So we should be able to dynamically load all of the questions, and then the scores and the totals should also be updated and submitted without having to update the spreadsheet content. So let's loop through, and also without having to update the web app within the Google Apps script. So we got our final score. We ended up getting 3 out of 6 questions correct. The name field, and then we've got the button to send score to sheet. Once we click that, it says the score is submitted, thank you. And let's take a look and see what we've got for the spreadsheet data. So we've got a score of 3, and the total number of questions is going to be 6. So that's how you can build a dynamic quiz application using JavaScript that's going to track and get the data from the spreadsheet and also track it into the spreadsheet. So go ahead and try it out, build your own version, and you can make some updates and customizations. And also, if you do change any of the questions within the questions sheet, that's going to also update them and add new questions within the quiz area.